Russia has issued a new warning to the United States that they will no longer abide by the intermediate nuclear, the INF treaty about the internuclear missiles. Russia has announced this just recently. We got out of it back in 2019 under the first Trump administration. Russia, for various reasons, didn't get out of it until that time, but they have now done so today. And we're going to talk with Colonel Doug Macgregor to find out what the ramifications are of this and whether this is something we need to be worried about, whether it's just no big deal at all. And then we're also going to look at where all the conflict in Ukraine is going and if there's anything there we need to be worried about. So first of all, Colonel, welcome back to the show, as we always love to have you on.
Hey, good to be here.
Let's jump into that right away here, because on the one hand, it might seem like, well, it's kind of old news, but on the separate hand, there may be some new elements to this. Gary, if you can put that Newsweek report back up here, this is what's coming out of the news. I think this actually came out yesterday. It says the Russian Foreign Ministry wrote, quote, against the backdrop of targeted steps by the United States, as a result of which the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty ceased to exist in 2019, and in subsequent years, the Russian Federation has proactively made efforts to maintain restraint in this area. The U.S. and its allies have not only openly outlined plans to deploy American land-based INF missiles in various regions, but have already made significant progress in practical implementations of their intentions. First of all, do you think that is there any substance to what the Russians are claiming there, or is this just them trying to justify putting more missiles into the mix?
No, I think they're being very truthful in the sense that we are trying to put weapons on the ground in Eastern Europe that can threaten Russia, that obviously violate the INF. The INF, as you know, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, was something that people worked very, very hard to build. And back in the 1970s and early 80s, when all of this came about, the Russians, or at that time the Soviets, had actually fielded intermediate range nuclear armed missiles. This posed a very immediate and dramatic and decisive threat, especially to Germany, Western Germany, and France and Italy and so forth. So we worked very, very hard to get this treaty established. One of the ways we did it was that we responded to the Soviets with our own Pershing missiles. Those missiles were brilliant weapons. There's no question about it. And at the time, the Soviets had no way to really match them. And these missiles would have reached their targets probably as soon as the Soviets launched their own missiles against us. I had a personal relationship with, at the time, Colonel Bill Odom, who later on became the National Security Agency head as a 3-star under Reagan and Weinberger. And he had a major role to play in that. And when I came back from Germany in 1980, he was asking what was the attitude. And our goal at that time was to prevent Germany from being leveraged out of the NATO alliance. There were people in Germany that said, well, the solution to all of this is we just declare neutrality, we'll leave NATO. Of course, that had no chance of happening, but there were lots of people saying it at the time. And we wanted to prevent that because we didn't see any reason why the Soviets should have the opportunity to bully and intimidate Europeans. So we developed the Pershing 1, Pershing 2 missiles were brilliant. The Soviets looked at this, came to the table and said, all right, let's ban this entire category, which was a very, very dramatic step and a very good one. It's unfortunate that in 2019, President Trump, on the advice, I think, of some people who were very wrong-headed, abolished that treaty. Now, there's some good news here, and that is that the New START treaty, the New Strategic Arms Limitations Talks treaty, called New START, signed under the Obama administration, was actually extended when it went out of business in 2021, and it was extended for another 6 years. So we don't have to worry about that strategic level nuclear agreement until 2026 next year. But these, some people view arms control as an illusion. It doesn't make any difference what people agree to do. They never completely agree to it. But the truth is that both we and the Soviets, and then subsequently we and the Russians, have done a pretty good job of adhering to the various treaties. These treaties have saved us a lot of money, and I think they have also created a climate of what I would call of thinking people that are sensitive to the nuclear issue, want to avoid a nuclear collision at all costs. And I think that's the real problem right now. Something has happened, and I'm not sure what it is, both in the senior ranks of the American military as well as in Washington among politicians on the Hill and in the White House. They think that this is something they can play with, that this is something they can maneuver. In other words, the whole threat of nuclear war. The Russians take it very seriously. They are not insensitive to the consequences of blast heat and radiation and the loss of millions of lives. But for some reason, we in the West don't seem to think in those terms. And so the Russians are taking prudent measures. They're going to move weapons closer into White Russia. They've already done some of that, as well as areas in the Western theater near St. Petersburg, north of that. And all of this is in response to things that we've been doing. And remember, we only very recently decided, for reasons that make no sense at all, to deploy tactical nuclear weapons to Great Britain, England, in fact. These are weapons designed to be delivered by aircraft against targets like St. Petersburg. So then you look at the Kaliningrad disaster, this general who was the co-architect of the disaster in the Afghan withdrawal, Donahue, a man who spent most of his military career in special ops, where I'm sure he was quite good. I just don't think special ops necessarily prepares you for strategic level thinking and discussions and decision making. But nevertheless, we have no real general staff corps. We have no real meritocracy when it comes to the selection of senior officers. So his statement is frightening, because that's the kind of thing that leads you down the road to a nuclear disaster. And I think whether people realize it or not, we're on that road. I don't think the Russians are bluffing. And
well, in fact, I want to go further. So I just showed you that on the Newsweek there, where it had the foreign ministry, the Russian foreign ministry claim about why they pulled out of this. And then we have this morning, that was yesterday, this morning, Dmitry Medvedev on X just a couple of hours ago, I think, said that the Russian foreign ministry statement on the withdrawal of the moratorium on the deployment of medium and short-range missiles is the result of NATO countries' anti-Russian policy. This new reality, all our opponents will have to reckon with. Expect further steps. So what do you suspect that he may mean about these further steps?
I think his point is that the Russians are not bluffing. President Trump, as we both know, says one thing and 2 weeks later says another. And we know that he responded recently to the statements about that Medvedev made in a fit of anger. He was supposedly very angry. And he deployed 2 submarines to positions closer, presumably to Western Europe and Northern Europe, than they had been otherwise deployed. First of all, you don't make decisions in a fit of anger. I mean, that's catastrophic. And then secondly, what Medvedev does is that he says things publicly that Putin absolutely refuses to say publicly. Remember, Putin's argument is, let's have private discussions. We can sit and talk about this in private. We don't discuss these matters in public, not because we want to keep everything hopelessly secret from the publics in Europe or the United States or Russia. But you can't make much progress when someone on the other side, and this is particularly true for President Trump, is exploiting the opportunity for some sort of political gain at home. And Putin wants nothing to do with that. So Medvedev, from time to time, steps out and he'll say something that Putin probably agrees with, but would never say himself. And I think that's what's happened. And Trump, President Trump, who is the head of state as well as the political leader of the country, would bother responding is really the question on my mind. Respond to President Putin by all means, but don't respond to Medvedev. He may be in the inner circle, but let's not impute to him anything more than an attack dog role and understand what that is. I mean, the Russians don't like Lindsey Graham, but I can tell you that President Putin listens to what President Trump says, not to what Lindsey Graham says.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I want to just for those who may not know, because for some, 1987 will be ancient history, but I want to get kind of a running start to see what this INF treaty was supposed to mean for American interest and American national security, and then how that changed in 2019. So first of all, here is a short piece from Ronald Reagan's announcement on the day he signed the INF treaty in 1987.
This treaty protects the interests of America's friends and allies. It also embodies another important principle, the need for glasnost, a greater openness in military programs and forces. We can only hope that this history-making agreement will not be an end in itself, but the beginning of a working relationship that will enable us to tackle the other issues, urgent issues before us. Strategic offensive nuclear weapons, the balance of conventional forces in Europe, the destructive and tragic regional conflicts that beset so many parts of our globe, and respect for the human and natural rights that God has granted to all men.
Now, obviously, that kind of gets to what you said a second ago, that aside from the specific issue of the terms of the treaty, whether they're being abided by or not, is one thing, but it also provides additional things, opportunities to talk to prevent any kind of general war, because they were really motivated, Reagan was, by preventing any kind of nuclear conflict. That seems to be the genesis of it for sure. But let me ask you, was his concern that he said, we don't want this to go in this other direction here because that wouldn't be good for us, was that borne out?
You know, I think the INF Treaty was a step in the right direction. It did produce openness. From our standpoint, it helped to eliminate a category of very dangerous weapons for all intents and purposes. That meant that both sides agreed, you know, we're not going to use these. As soon as you decide not to use a particular category of nuclear weapons, that sends a hugely important signal to everyone. It means neither side wants to go to nuclear war. Very, very important. Now, the other thing that Reagan did mention, but was very important at the time, was to keep Germany inside the NATO alliance. And I can't stress that enough, because there were attitudes in Germany among many people that this is something they didn't want. They did not want nuclear weapons on German soil. And actually speaking, Eisenhower struggled with this in the 1950s. And he was approached about something very similar. Said, well, you have to put nuclear weapons into Germany. He says, I don't want to. And he said, by the way, if we put them there and the Soviets attack, they're in such overwhelming numbers, they'll overrun the nuclear weapons before we get a chance to use them. So he said, if we're going to have nuclear weapons, they should be at sea, or they could be delivered by the Air Force, or they should be on the periphery. In other words, perhaps Norway, Iceland, or North Africa, but not in Central East Europe. Ultimately, he reneged because people said, no, again, we can't get the Germans to stay in the alliance if we don't promise to protect them. And that means we have to put nuclear weapons on the ground in Germany, because that then becomes a last minute trigger for the use of strategic nuclear weapons if it looks like Germany could possibly be overrun. Now, that's the past. Here we are today. What are we doing right now? Well, as I said before, we've kept New START in existence. So on the strategic level, we're still abiding largely by the guidelines that define launchers and warheads for strategic nuclear weapons. That's a very good thing. I think it's a very bad thing that we've opened up this can of worms, though, with the INF, because the missiles that we see now, you look at the Oreshnik, for instance, we can't stop it. We can't stop any of these hypersonic missiles. We can have hypersonic missiles launched from any number of different locations, and we can't stop them. We need to get that across. The most recent studies by NATO suggested that they could only defend perhaps 5% of NATO territory with air and missile defense. So who are we kidding?
Yeah.
They're talking about going to war. You've lost your mind. Today, I was sent a report from a source inside NATO about the transportation infrastructure and rail lines. It said, we're not prepared for a large-scale war. The transportation infrastructure is not sufficiently developed. We don't have control of it. We don't have any means of protecting it. So again, it's just craziness on steroids. I think it was James Madison in Federalist number 10 who said, We may not always have especially bright, capable, intelligent, and informed statesmen at the helm. In other words, he was talking about the White House. Therefore, we have the Supreme Court. Therefore, we have Congress and so forth. Well, we don't have very many enlightened people anywhere right now.
Right, yeah.
They're out of touch with reality. They don't get it. Every single exercise, and I certainly saw several of these. You may have as well, but I certainly did, particularly when I was a full colonel and I monitored these things and I was able to read about them, particularly when I was at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. All the exercises and simulations that involved direct conflict with the Soviets, they all reached the same conclusion. Inevitably, if we go to war with these people, we're going to have a nuclear exchange. It's very simple. We can't field enough conventional forces. We started back in the 1960s. We developed this thing called flexible response. We were trying to find any way we could to sort of keep the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons very, very high. But nevertheless, in all of these, we inevitably went to the use of a nuclear weapon. Then the other conclusion was, well, if we do this, we can't control escalation. Whereas once you use a nuclear weapon, it's over. And then finally, General Powell in the early 1990s, when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he said, don't come in here and tell me we could drop a tactical nuke on somebody and the Russians are not, or the Soviets are not going to say, that's a nuke. In other words, oh, no, don't worry about that. That's a low-yield nuclear weapon. That's not going to lead to any major conflict. He says, that's just crazy. That's complete nonsense. So the conclusion that everybody reached, I don't want to say everybody because there are always outliers, but the majority of senior military leaders, and I would argue even on the Hill, people like Sam Nunn and others had reached the conclusion that you wanted to avoid war with the Soviets at all cost. Well, all of a sudden now you've got a president who seems to be going out of his way to provoke the Russians. And he now has as one of his spokesmen a 4-star general who is threatening Russian national sovereign territory around Kaliningrad, this little enclave of East Prussia that FDR gave Stalin at the end of the war, or in the spring of 1945. That's unfortunate. I don't think FDR should have done that, but then again, there are a lot of things that FDR should not have done, but it's irrelevant now. It's
it is.
That's now Russian national territory. If you attack it, everything is fair game. You're going to be at war with the Russian state. Now, this is nuts. This is insane. No sitting general officer should announce to the world any intentions or confirm. This is even more important. If you're a Russian intelligence officer, this is a bonanza because he's just confirmed that these aren't just intentions. We have plans.
Plans, yeah.
Insane. What planet are these people on? Listen, I don't think this is something, by the way, that this General Donahue cooked up. I think he was given leave to say this. Did he suggest it? Maybe. I don't know. But I think he had been given the green light to do it, which worries me even more because that suggests that you have people in the SecDef's office as well as in the White House that are out of touch with reality. You don't want to go down this road for the reasons I just answered. We've been avoiding this stuff for 60 years?
Right.
All of a sudden now it's okay. Have these people lost their minds? I don't know, but it's back to Madison. We will not always have enlightened men at the helm of state. No kidding.
Well, and this whole situation here started not just recently, but under the first President Trump term. Here's what he said in 2019 when we got out, claiming that the Russians were cheating.
But for the last few years, the U.S. says Russia has developed and deployed this missile on display last week in Moscow that violates the treaty, and Russia refused U.S. requests to destroy it. Today, President Trump said as long as Russia wasn't abiding by the treaty, neither would the U.S.
So unless we're going to have something that we all agree to, we can't be put at the disadvantage of going by a treaty, limiting what we do when somebody else doesn't go by that treaty.
But the Russians say this American missile defense system in Romania could be modified to launch an offensive missile, and therefore the U.S. is the violator. Today, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov called the U.S. suspension a mistake.
We think that the agreement is essential. It is within interests of our security and European security, and it would be irresponsible for one side to shatter it.
So what do you think about that claim at the time that President Trump made, that the Russians were cheating on with that missile that they were showing on the screen there, and therefore that's why we got out?
Well, let's go back to what the last Russian said or talked about, which is the air and missile defense installation in Romania. Remember, this is something that we established there ostensibly for the purpose of protecting Europe from Iranian ballistic missiles. Now, let's stop and consider that for a minute. Here's Iran, and this is what year, 2019?
Right.
And has never expressed any interest in or any intention under any circumstances to attack anyone in the world with anything except Israel in response to an attack. Now, that I didn't even mention ballistic missiles, but we put this thing into Romania and said that with the radars and the anti-missile missiles, these things pose no threat to Russia. This was entirely focused on Iran. Well, I'm sure the Russians doubled over in laughter. Why would they ever believe such a thing? When I was on active duty, I suggested that in order to allay Russian fears, which I quickly found out nobody gave a damn about, was to invite the Russians to inspect the facility, to satisfy themselves that this facility was, in fact, not aimed at them. So, well, that's ridiculous, Macgregor. You've lost your mind. We're never going to do such a thing. Well, that's what you do if you don't want a war.
War, yeah.
You know, I mean, I've talked about this before, and it's never a guarantee that it will work. But for decades, you had a personal adjutant, we would say aide de camp, assigned to the German emperor, one assigned to the Russian emperor, and one assigned to the emperor in Vienna in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Each one represented an emperor from the other camp. And this was designed to ensure that personal communications between the three could occur regardless of the circumstances, conditions, crises, conflicts, whatever. That ultimately falls apart in 1914. Actually, it fell apart a little bit before then, but it was a good idea. There is no reason why we should not have a system between Beijing, Moscow, and the United States to deal routinely all the time with these matters. We should have liaison officers here from those two nations, and ours should be where they are. The whole thing is to allay fear. In other words, to build confidence, reassure that there is no intention to strike anybody. Now, again, somebody will say, well, Macgregor, you've lost your mind. You know, we deter these people because they don't know what we'll do. Very, very dangerous position to take with nuclear weapons. It's very easy to misinterpret any kind of action we may take any number of different places as evidence for an imminent strike. And
right.
The same thing is true today for us. We don't know enough about Russia. We used to know a great deal more. We don't know very much right now. And I think the Russians don't really understand early warning. And I think Ted Postal has spoken to you about this, may have spoken to others, that their early warning system leaves much to be desired. We ought to be interested in those things. Instead, we are actively provoking, offending, insulting, and attacking people on every conceivable level. And people need to understand that sanctions are not harmless, that when they are meant to do damage. And most people, most of the time in the world, regard the use of economic sanctions as an act of war. We need to get out of that business.
And you know, some of these concerns that are playing out, some of which you just mentioned, were listed in 2019 by a European Federica Mogherini, who was worried about the development in the negative direction.
Today, NATO backed the U.S. accusation against Russia, but some European officials, like EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini, fear the start of a new arms race. From the late 70s through the late 80s, the Soviet Union and the U.S. deployed mobile, nuclear-tipped missiles to Europe. The INF eliminated them, and European officials say they don't want to turn back the clock.
What we definitely don't want to see is our continent going back to being a battlefield or a place where other superpowers confront themselves. This belongs to a faraway history.
And now that faraway history is run back up. I mean, you literally just described the very scenario she feared about.
Yeah, well, here we are. And I think it's gotten worse because this is really about Trump, who thinks he's leading a crusade against BRICS. He's trying to bash, bully, intimidate anyone who does business with Russia. He's tried to do that to China. It's all failed miserably. None of it is going to change anything. Fighting BRICS is a losing battle at this stage. If anything, BRICS is a consequence of our behavior in the past. People are just really tired of being bullied by us through the IMF, the World Bank, the SWIFT system. This is what de-dollarization is all about. And I think that President Trump and his advisors undoubtedly have told him this, that you can use the strategic military dimension as a way to leverage our power against BRICS. And of course, you have the other problem is the same people that want us to go to war in the Middle East all the time are the same people that are pushing war against Russia, even though they keep insisting, well, we're not talking about a direct confrontation. Well, if you're not talking about a direct confrontation, you certainly sound like it. And they hate Russia. They hate it because it's the primary fortress holding out against globalism. And President Trump, who we thought we elected because he was not a globalist, seems to have taken on the mantle of leadership for globalism. So destroy Russia, destroy Orthodox Christianity, destroy the population, destroy its people, strip it of resources, on and on and on. It's just insane. It's crazy. It's all failed. There's no chance that it's going to happen anytime soon. But nevertheless, he's leading this now. I don't even think he understands what he's leading. This is not something in the interest of the American people or the United States.
Well, and let's just keep going down the list of concerns here. Whatever he may have intended, it seems that it's kind of opening up others to continue moving down in provocative areas against Russia, maybe part of that same plan that you're talking about, or at least intent. And that, Gary, if you can throw up in your browser that there's a plan by the UK to interdict. Let's see. Yeah, according to this, Britain plans to use NATO allies to launch a mass attack on the so-called Shadow Fleet. The Russian Foreign Intelligence Service has said this is what the Russians are claiming that they have intercepted that the UK plans to do. According to London's plan, the impetus for such a campaign should be a closely watched incident involving one or more tankers. The plan envisions large-scale diversion, the damage of which will allow declaring the transport of Russian oil a threat to all international shipping. What do you make of this claim here? Is that valid?
Well, first of all, we don't have multiple sources that can confirm this. And this is based on what is allegedly an intelligence capture, right? Somebody intercepted the signal, somebody's decoded it, somebody's read it, or it was provided over the clear. We don't know. What we can say is that MI6 in Great Britain has been at the very beginning of this war with Ukraine, heavily involved in what I would call the false flag, dirty tricks agenda. We know that they provided the false flags in Syria that led President Trump to launch missiles into the desert in Syria. This is back during his first term. We know that the SAS working with MI6 has been very effective in little raids designed to embarrass the Russians, damage ships sitting in harbor, hit isolated radars or missile sites, or simply terrorize the Russian population by killing Russian civilians. So I wouldn't be surprised. But what I think is interesting is the following. First of all, the British are talking about what amounts to a sea embargo. In other words, using American and allied naval power, primarily U.S. naval power, to intercept and halt the transport of oil over the sea, oil that's Russian, in origin, presumably. That's very interesting to me because, the British, this is their thinking. Britain, like us, is historically a maritime power. The problem with that is I don't think it would make much difference anymore. Oh, it'll hurt a little bit if we were to do it. But you have this thing called the One Belt, One Road, and we've already seen the trains coming from China all the way to Iran now. We're going to see more of this rail and road infrastructure open up with the result that they'll be able to travel over the space of a few days what normally would take weeks at sea. So I don't think I don't think you can expect the level of success from this that is implied. But here's something else. You start stopping other people's ships carrying oil that ostensibly or reputedly comes from Russia, you're going to be at war again. You're going to be not just at war with Russia, with any number of different countries. I mean, this makes a mockery of our supposed interest in freedom of navigation. It's the exact opposite. We're freedom of navigation for us and nobody else.
Yeah, that's not going to work very well. I also want to discuss something about the if there is this, whether it's a coordinated plan or just common thinking that the West just wants to keep harming Russia, whether it's this way or just keeping the war going, I don't know that that's going to be very effective. There was an interesting comment in it's called the Resident Telegram channel, a Ukrainian resident. They made some interesting comments here. It says that against the backdrop of the EU's strategic paralysis and the U.S.'s sluggishness on giving ammunition to Ukraine, Trump claimed he was going to do it, but none of the stuff has come through yet. It has been half a month since Trump proposed that Europeans buy weapons for Kiev, but no agreed procurement mechanism has appeared. Some countries are unwilling to allocate funds. Others have outright refused to participate. All this is happening while even moderate Ukrainian analysts warn, quote, if the situation does not change by winter, Russian troops will be near Kiev. And then it goes on to continue to talk about how everything's just falling apart in Ukraine. There was a report out that, yeah, that's the one right there, that one of the Ukrainian official said that reconnaissance support estimated that Ukraine's military was suffering daily casualties of 300 dead, 750 injured per day, and about 500 troops desert every day. And she also warned that Russian forces could be up to Kiev by the winter if we don't change something. But there is no evidence that anything can be changed. That's from the Times in London on Sunday. So the situation on the battlefield is falling apart, and the Ukraine's troops, which has always been, I think, kind of the linchpin, no matter how many weapons or ammunition or anything else. And we could also talk about all these aerial attacks that Russia's been stepping up. One of the other things that the resident mentioned here is that the Ukrainian intelligence suggests that by the end of this year, the number of drone strikes from Russia could be over 1,000 per day, not just hundreds, but in the thousands, and it will continue to escalate up. So is this plan going to continue to go on? And what do you think, actually, better question, is the risk for us to bring this to an end or risk going to a nuclear war? Why do we want to do that, Doug? Why would anyone want to risk a nuclear escalation instead of just bringing this to an end?
I hope, I can't prove it, but I hope that more sober minds will prevail, certainly in the Department of Defense, and make it very clear that the notion of escalating to the level of nuclear conflict is simply off the table, that there's no chance for that to have any good outcome. And I would hope that somebody would also urge the president, at least through his advisors, to reconsider the wisdom of mentioning it, not overreacting. Too many people emote. This is particularly true in Washington and particularly true for President Trump. This is not the time to emote. Now, that's the first thing. Second thing is all of this business, this equipment that's being promised, in some cases, it doesn't even exist. When you start looking at Patriot batteries and radars and missiles, that's not even around. I mean, what are you going to ship over there? And even if you shipped what was promised by President Trump, somebody said to me from Raytheon, we're looking at 15 minutes of air-to-air and missile defense. In other words, there's not enough missiles to make a damn difference. And I think that's something that hasn't sunk in. I think the president should be briefed in great detail on this and understand that he can promise the sun, maybe get the moon, and probably only long after Ukraine has fallen apart. Now, this morning, there was a published statement allegedly drawn from the Russian general staff that Ukraine has at the outside 3 months left, 90 days. And that within those 90 days, everything will collapse. Now, the reason was that first we've got battalions of boys and old men. I mean, I can just see guys like me at my age running around with rifles out there. good luck. And the same thing is true with boys, kids that are 15, 14, 15, 16. This is absurd. It's ridiculous. So this regime is dying. There's no question about it. And long before MI6 gets to install Zelensky as their chosen successor to Zelensky, this thing is going to be over. So the question is, what do you do if you're sitting in the White House? Well, President Trump is very loath to stand up publicly and say, well, I guess I was wrong. I couldn't end this in 24 hours. Oh, I guess I was wrong. I can't bring these people to the peace table. I guess I was wrong. That's not going to happen. You're going to hear a lot of stupid crap about, well, President Trump tried his best, but President Putin lied to him. Well, that's all nonsense. That's just crap. Listen to what President Putin says over and over and over again. It has not changed over the last 36 months, frankly. And he's taken steps periodically to tell them exactly what the conditions are. Finally, there's this. What did we do after the Vietnam debacle? We stopped talking about it. Did you ever hear anybody stand up and say, well, I was right, but, things didn't work out quite that way. So, no, nobody does that. Generals don't stand up and say, I was wrong. Everything I predicted never happened. My assessments were wrong. You could start with General Paul Harkins back in 1963, go all the way through up to Fred Wyand at the end as the commander in Vietnam. Nobody does that. And I think what will happen is what we recommended, at least I recommended from the very beginning. President Trump, you want this to stop? We agree. Cease the delivery of all military aid immediately. Arrange for the delivery of humanitarian assistance to the Ukrainians that need it and medical care and so forth through a third country. Get everyone who is an American citizen, whether they're in or out of uniform, whether they're intelligence or conventional military, it doesn't make any difference. All need to get out of Ukraine now. Do those things, and the Russians will then take you seriously because they'll recognize, the Americans have finally figured it out. We don't have any vital strategic interest in Ukraine. We never have. I mean, that's the simple truth. We wish everybody well, but we're not interested. This is an artificially created war. We created it with the help of our British friends and others in NATO. It needs to end. Only we can end it quickly. But you don't end it by presiding at some peace talk where everybody stands next to you and smiles and says, we love you, President Trump. You're such a great man. That's not going to happen. So just cut bait. Get out. You would think a businessman who has seen more than a few bad investments over many years would know when, that's it. We're going to take the loss and move on. We can't, let's not feed this loss anymore.
Right. Exactly.
He's done with it. That's what he needs to do. I think eventually that's what we will do. Because if you go down the road that's being charted by this General Donahue, you're going to destroy everything.
Well, here's the worry. You just a second ago you said the hope is that maybe saner heads can eventually prevail to come to the conclusions that you just mentioned here, but to the contrary, you have people emoting, as you said a second ago, also in the opposite direction. You mentioned earlier about the trolling basically that Medvedev did against Trump. When he said the issue, Gary, if you could put that up there, where Medvedev said, the dead hand. No, not that one, the other one. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, where he said, and about India's and Russia's dead economies entering very dangerous territory. Well, let him remember his favorite movies about the Walking Dead, as well as how dangerous the fabled dead hand can be. And that's where Trump interpreted, or else someone interpreted for him, that Medvedev was threatening nuclear war against the United States, which is not what the dead hand is. We'll just point that out, first of all. But in response, that's when Trump sent those nuclear subs publicly. As you said, he responded out of emotion to send something in, which is a signal that you're thinking more seriously about nuclear weapons. Well, if anyone was wondering what kind of reaction that would get from the group of people that like the Donahues and some others, we got that from Brother Jack Keane.
What Medvedev did here to precipitate the president's actions, it once again brandished the threat of nuclear weapons use. And believe me, this is a part of their instrument of national power. They use psychological warfare is how I would describe it. And they were quite successful in the Biden administration because as a result of threatening the use of tactical nuclear weapons, Biden restricted the use of our weapons. He held them back, long-range missiles, tanks, F-16s, to name a few. The Europeans were onto it, and they realized that this was a bluff, and we should stop submitting to that bluff and changing our behavior. And they forced the Biden administration to provide those items I just suggested. The Europeans, that is, because they were, in a sense, calling the Russians bluff. The president has heard this, and he wants them to know unequivocally that he's in charge here. He's not going to submit to this kind of intimidation and coercion and psychological warfare. And that is the message he is sending by announcing the deployment of 2 nuclear-powered submarines.
That's the message he's sending. So Putin is just bluffing, and Biden deserves condemnation because he was worried about nuclear war, but Trump is not because he's tough, and that's what Putin's going to have to wonder. What does that tell you about where we're heading?
Well, I think we need to pause and point out, and I think Scott Ritter and Larry Johnson and others have done this, that the dead hand is simply a mechanism that ensures that if the Russians are a victim of first strike, and regardless of how much damage the first strike does, including kill them in great numbers, the dead hand is simply a mechanism that ensures that the Russians strike back with everything they've got. That's about it. So it's really a defensive mechanism. It's not an offensive one. So it's important to keep that in mind. The second thing, as we've said before, this is Medvedev. This is not Putin. President Trump should respond to other heads of state, not to people that are not heads of state, frankly. They don't matter. What matters is what the head of state says, the man who's actually in control. Now, the last bit of this is disturbing because Trump's personality is easily manipulated by people who are saying, well, if you do this, boss, you're going to be tough. And that's what Americans want. They want a tough guy out there to lay down the law and make it clear what we're not going to do and what they have to do. A lot of people in my generation that were involved in the Vietnam War, unfortunately, are very easily seduced by this. More than one person who was in Vietnam has said to me on several occasions, we got to be tough with these people. They're bad. We know them. We dealt with them before. Come on, this is not the Cold War. These people are not communists. They're Russians. And while there is always overlap, because underlying culture and national identity, ethnicity, religion, language, all those things always assert themselves and are always more important than any ideology. In this particular case, what they're being accused of and what is real are not the same thing, as you know, and as you pointed out. But this kind of thing very much appeals to the boomer generation, of which I'm a member. And I think Jack Keane exemplifies this. It's all about bullying somebody and being tough. Well, not really. This is about avoiding nuclear war, period, at all costs. It's about identifying real strategic interests, not imaginary interests. There is no interest on our part in what happens in eastern Ukraine, never has been. You could make an argument that we should have made it clear from the very beginning that at least the Dnieper River should be respected as a demarcation line beyond which we recommend the Russians not move. That could have been done early on, and that would have made sense. And I think the Russians feel that way in any case, because if they had wanted to cross that river, they could have done that much earlier than has happened. I mean, they just have refused to cross that river because they don't want Ukraine. They've never been interested in ruling Ukrainians. Anybody who knows the history knows the Western Ukrainians, knows the Poles, knows the Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians. The Russians don't want to be bothered with those people. They're not fools. What they're trying to do is secure their country. And they want people to respect their legitimate national security interests. So this has nothing to do with being strong or bullying anybody. But I think President Trump is receptive to that message. It's not a good message. He shouldn't be. And again, it goes back to my earlier comment. Sometimes we won't have enlightened men at the helm, as pointed out by James Madison. So it's important that we have people in uniform as well as people who are civilian appointees and elected to office that will exercise a little more, let us say, balanced common sense.
Well, we can certainly hope that that occurs at some point, or even just self-interest. If it gets to any kind of critical point, will rule the day and prevent stupidity that could lead to catastrophic outcomes for our country.
And there's something else. There's one thing to also point out that everybody misses. We always have missile boats and attack subs at sea. That's probably arguably the most important strategic instrument at our disposal in terms of national defense. That's why I think our submarine fleet is too small and needs to be much larger and more capable.
Yeah.
Always have, and felt that should be our top priority. But we've always had those ships out there, those boats, rather. And those boats can attack Russia or anybody else very quickly from any number of locations. The second thing is the Russians have boats like that. And they, too, are off our shores. Who are we kidding? We need to wake up and understand that this is a very dangerous set of circumstances. Someone brought to my attention, I think it was 2010 or 2011, the people in Nome, Alaska were isolated. It had been a terrible ice storm, massive snows, worse than what you would normally expect. And we couldn't get any fuel oil to them. And so the Coast Guard finally said, listen, the only people that can get fuel to these people quickly are the Russians. And we asked the Russians to help. And they did. They sent a tanker in behind a Coast Guard icebreaker. And we were lucky to have that icebreaker because at the time, there were other icebreakers and they were all out of commission. Today, the Russians have the largest fleet of icebreakers in the world.
All right.
But my point is, we asked for help and assistance, and they gave it quickly and unhesitatingly, and they didn't gouge us on the price of the oil, which I can't emphasize enough. We got to get past this artificial conflict that has been created in Ukraine.
Agreed. Couldn't agree with you more.
How to do that, except the president has got to stand up and be courageous and say, this needs to end. I'm ending it. This is what I'm doing. We're getting out. But thus far, there's no evidence that he will do that.
Yeah, and I worry that on Friday, on the 8th of August, he's just going to take it another notch in the wrong direction with all these sanctions and all that. But we'll have to hold that for another day. In the amount of time I got with you today, though, there's news out this morning that Benjamin Netanyahu either is or maybe already out of a cabinet meeting where he's going to give approval for the occupation of the entirety of the Gaza Strip. And in a Fox News meeting this morning, there was a pro-Israeli guy named Dov Heikind who was explaining why this is something Netanyahu has to do.
I believe it will be approved by the cabinet, and Israel really has absolutely no choice. There was a deal on the table. Israel was prepared to make concessions to get back some of the hostages. And Hamas, with the support that it is getting from radicals all over the world, they believe they're winning. They believe that their plan, what they are demanding that they be able to keep their weapons and that they continue to control Gaza into the future. That's impossible. That can never happen. The leaders of Hamas just a couple of days ago said, applauded what happened on October 7th and said, we will do it again and again. And we can believe Hamas when they say that.
So what do you make of the fact that Israel is afraid of Hamas? And man, if they don't go in and clean this deal out and basically eliminate, and I mean all of the Hamas, which I think maybe would mean every male in the Gaza Strip, what do you make of that charge?
Well, the Israeli chief of staff, who seems to be a very able man, has pointed out that it could take years to root out Hamas from Gaza. Stop and consider that. And they're talking about an area right now roughly the size of Philadelphia. And if you send in the IDF, they'll be there for years. That's his warning. I don't think you need to say too much beyond that. However, Mr. Netanyahu and his country is in a very difficult position. Now, what is that position? The two of them, both he and his country, are facing desperation. he has launched a number of different attacks in different directions at different people on the assumption that he'd better do this while he has absolute unconditional control of the United States. And he does right now. He has the immediate obedience of the U.S. Armed Forces. Israel first is the motto in this administration. So if you're in his position, and remember, he's got his own private problems, but if you look at the state as a whole, in his view, he's either got to win it all or lose it all. Because anything he does, short of total extermination of the Palestinians in Gaza and the destruction of all his other enemies in the region, means that Israel might not succeed. If it doesn't succeed, in his view, it will be destroyed. In other words, this is a do or die moment for him. And I don't think he sees that he has any alternative. So I'm sure the IDF chief of staff has been told that. And you're going to see them do exactly what this previous spokesman, Heikind, said. Now, how this is going to suppress the forces of anti-Semitism is beyond my imagination. I mean, I think the only thing that's happened over the last year or so is that anti-Semitism has reached new heights and continues to spread because there's so much hatred for Israel. So I don't know how he thinks this is somehow or another going to defeat anti-Semitism. I think he'll just feed the fires of it. And that has always been my objection to this, that the way Israel has set this thing up is exactly what Netanyahu is doing. It's a do or die moment. And they're probably not going to survive.
Well, I was going to say it may also be a do and die moment if he does it.
Oh, yeah.
So I think this will be counterproductive because I mean, yesterday there was I saw a video that there was 300,000 people marching in Sydney, Australia, because there is growing Western anger against the Netanyahu government, against the policies of Israel. Obviously, we have issues where there is reports of large-scale deaths from hunger, malnutrition at serious rates. We showed on our show yesterday that American Lieutenant Colonel Special Forces guy, Tony Aguilar, who returned from on the ground there and reported that the atrocities are as bad as what people are claiming, completely contradicting what our own ambassador said, what Benjamin Netanyahu said just days before that. You can't just, even if you just said, just look at it purely military, it would be dumb to get into something that's going to last years and not be able to solve it. But Doug, do you see that Israel politically, I'm talking internationally, they continue to have this situation where they continue the war in the Gaza Strip where people are dying in large numbers?
Well, I think their hope is that the Egyptian army, which is sitting across from them, I guess there are 50 or 60,000 troops over there, will relent and instead of intervene in support of the Palestinians who are facing imminent destruction, will instead tear down the barriers and allow the Palestinians to pour into the Sinai. I think that's what they're hoping. I don't know. I mean, right now it seems that paralysis grips the government in Cairo. The Sisi has decided that doing nothing is his best option. But that could change very quickly. General Sisi may or may not survive. And a new regime may come to power and say, the hell with this, we're going to fight. Now, the argument is that, like Turkey, Egypt is a financial economic basket case. They're too in debt. They can't do anything. But then that assumes that the Russians, the Chinese, and others who are sympathetic to them will not help them in some way. So I wouldn't bet on that. But that's where we are. And, it's interesting. The Australian government, the new one, has just agreed to buy naval combatants, ships, weapons from Japan. In other words, they've moved away from us. And I think we're going to see more of that in the future. The Japanese have told us, frankly, to fly a kite. They're going to buy as much oil and gas as they want from Russia. They could care less. The Chinese, the same thing. I think this BRICS thing is going to accelerate. I think you're going to have more and more and more members saddle up and join. It makes sense to do so. Otherwise, you are in a debt trap created for you by the United States government and the dollar. So I think all of this is going to backfire. Again, what do you do if you're president of the United States? You're interested in doing what's in the interest of the American people. Is it in our interest to be co-conspirators in the mass murder or expulsion of millions of people from Gaza? Does this help us and assist us in any way in the region? Does it assist us globally? I don't think it does. You can ask the same question about how does it help us to stay engaged in eastern Ukraine and cause battalions of boys and old men at gunpoint to be herded into Russian machine gun, artillery, and rocket fire. I don't think it does. But, I hold the minority opinion right now, and this is, after all, the Israel First administration.
Well, that's it's a really unpleasant thing to have to hear, but the evidence seems to pretty strongly support that because, like you say, it's not in America's interest to attack Iran when we weren't threatened by anything. So it's hard to argue with your statement there. And I just don't know where this is going to end up with America. It doesn't seem to me this is sustainable, but I don't have a clear vision on what it would manifest into. I mean, what is your view on, because you mentioned those two things, our support for Ukraine, our support for Israel are not in America's interest and are antithetical to our interest, but where do you see this going? How might it affect America?
Well, I think NATO and the European Union are both going to go out of business. It's a question of when, not if. There is tremendous discontent in Europe with the European Union that has tried to make itself into an international governing body and subjugate all of Europe to its will. That's dead. Everybody's sick to death of it. Most people in most cases are sympathetic to President Orban in Hungary and Fico in Slovakia. I think you're going to see more people like that emerge. The leadership in Croatia is much more sober-minded, has refused to have anything to do with the stupidity in Ukraine. I think Slovenia is not far behind, but they're smaller and a little less courageous as a result. I understand there's their reservations. So I think the EU thing is going to collapse. It's coming. Italy is already on the edge of dumping it. The Greeks are. So that's going to go away. NATO, what is NATO? Where is the great NATO army that's prepared to arm up, saddle up, and march east? I don't see it. I think anybody who imagines that is, smoking something, and it's not legal. So I think these institutions have outlived their utility and their necessity. So I guess what you'll see is a sort of a gradual abandonment of NATO and this Ukraine madness that starts in Poland and Slovakia and Hungary and Romania and moves west.
So let me ask you this in the last bit of time we have here. Let me give you a scenario, which I don't think at all is, outlandish or improbable. One is that eventually you're going to have the Ukraine army just collapse. Yeah, at some point it nearly has to, just by math. And separately, that either the Western or American economies, specifically, have a severe recession. And there's lots of warning signs on our economy right now, despite President Trump firing the person who gave the bad news the other day. I don't think that's going to change the actual reality on the ground, which is not trending in a good direction. And all these tariffs he's talking about putting on possibly on Friday could accelerate that demise. What happens to those two issues you mentioned there, support for NATO and support for Ukraine, if the Ukraine army collapses or if our economy collapses, and God help us if both of those things happen?
Well, I think many people like Jeffrey Gundlach and certainly Peter Schiff, I think also James Ricard, a number of people out there have all said, look, when this financial crisis strikes, and in fact, Warren Buffett made this point, there will be no TARP. In other words, there's not going to be a rescue package that comes out of the government. Those days are over. Private equity is in a lot of trouble. You've got people like Larry Fink and David Rubenstein that are staring at the abyss. They could lose trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. We have $3 trillion worth of commercial real estate investment in our banking system. and the real estate market, both residential and commercial, is poised to plummet. So no one can predict with accuracy when this happens. Nassim Taleb has talked about this. He's much more competent to discuss it than I am. He's the one that pointed out there is no reserve currency except gold. And I think he's right. So if you take all of those things together, you know this is coming, Dan. You're right. When that comes, and I don't know exactly when, but I think sooner rather than later. A lot of people say, oh, no, we can go on like this for years. No, I don't think so. When that happens, people are going to say, Ukraine? What's that? The Middle East? No, that's not important. In other words, everything beyond the borders of the United States will shrink to insignificance to what's happening here at home, because we'll be dealing with supply chain problems, the distribution of food, products that are vital to everyday life. The one area where we may not have serious problems, at least initially, fortunately, is fuel. But that could change. And prices, we've artificially suppressed interest rates. And despite that, if you look at the bond market, we're trying to hold down interest rates. And what happens in the bond market? The yields keep rising and rising, and then they'll fall back a little bit, and then they rise and rise. They fall back a little bit, and they rise and rise. At some point, you're going to hit 5% on the 10-year bonds, and most people regard that as the bellwether of disaster. And we can't pay the debt, what we owe, the interest on our national sovereign debt, which is now over $37 trillion and rapidly expanding. So I think your point is valid. It's almost as though we're living in a house and we've got a fire in the kitchen, and everyone is saying, well, that's in the kitchen. We're here in the living room. Those in the dining room are fine. The fire's not going to spread. They've got it under control. Well, good luck with that, because I don't think so. And eventually it'll burn the house down. That's what people have been predicting. I think they're right. And then who cares what happens down the road in the next town over? You're worried about your own home. And I think that's what will happen in the United States.
I think that probably will. And unfortunately, I think it's going to require that, because I think too many people are just like, I'm not worried about that. And it's the collapse. And people have been warning about the looming economic downturn. It hasn't happened. Like, even though 2008 happened, it's like, well, that was an anomaly, but it hadn't happened now. So it's never going to, so we don't have to make any changes. That's why I think it's going to require that before we finally wake up. And well, that's going to have a lot of consequences, but well, I guess we'll have to visit those when we get there. But in any case, boy, really appreciate this great deal of clarity you had with us today, because this really does point out just what's at stake here and what's not important to the United States, and what we should do to reevaluate or reestablish our priorities. And I really appreciate that.
Okay, Dan, good to see you.
And listen, also to you guys, if you have some friends who like to get their information via podcast, we are there too. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict. Let your friends know, because a lot of them will really appreciate that. And we certainly do too. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done that on your way out. That helps us more than you think as well. And we will look forward to seeing you on the very next episode of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.